in the chat. Depending on how many people join us today in the live session, we might unmute some of you just to say hello and where you're from. Some people are giving their apologies at the moment and will be joining in post on YouTube. I'm just going to make a quick phone call to one of the panelists. Okay, Ellie's just joined us. Brilliant. If you're struggling to connect, just give me a call and I'll walk you through it. Okay. Right. Okay. Look, we've got quite a lot of content to get through today, so let's not hold that up, and people will join when they're ready. And if they're struggling, feel free to email me or message me directly. So welcome to February session on AI in health and social care, and great to see so many familiar faces, and it's great to have so many people joining in conversation, not just on this WebEx, but throughout the intermittent period of time. Just to remind ourselves of some norms for those of you who are just joining us today. When using the chat box functionality, what we try to remind people to do is keep the conversation verbal. If you're looking to speak, you can message me directly to unmute you, and I can get you to talk directly. If you're chatting in the chat box, we just have some norms around that. So if I'm talking about the role of AI in healthcare, if you can do @Dom or @Dominic Cushionen, just so people know that you're talking to me, and we can tack onto the conversation. It's a little bit easier to follow. Also, if you do have Twitter or any other social media accounts you want people to connect with, please share in the thread, and people will connect with you directly. The team today is myself and John, who will be helping co-facilitate today. Any questions or comments in the box or people tweeting, please let John know, and we'll be able to bring that into the wider conversation. John, do you want to say hello quickly?
Thanks, Don. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'll just be in the background. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat channel, and I'll answer as best I can. Thanks.
And thanks, John. And then we have two great people with us today. Suzanne is leading a conversation around AI in education, and Eleonora Harwick from Reform will be talking about the documentation and the paper that they sent out a couple of weeks back, and I'm sure we all would welcome their conversations. Any comments or questions as they're discussing through their presentations, feel free to add that into the chat box. If you're communicating outside of this chat box, please use, out of this WebEx, please use the hashtag AI community, just so we can keep a track of who's saying what, so we can bring that into future conversations. I'm not going to do too much of an intro, but I just want to open up the activity again in this session and enable some participation. So what I'm going to ask you to do is in the top left-hand corner of your screen, you can just point out where you are in the country, so you know where people are coming from. And see if that works.
Which screen?
The top left-hand corner. Nope, is that not working? Am I having a technical glitch with? Okay, I'll have to come back to that. So let me come back to see why that's not working on this session. well, we all know that I'm from Birmingham, so we'll move on. So there's a couple of things to talk about. There's also a piece of work that I'm working on, and I'll have Melissa and Tina, who are doing some work around collating some information, talk at the end. But pulling together all the people and the organizations who are talking about AI in healthcare. If you're interested in helping filling in some of the gaps in this mind map, can you please message myself directly? And maybe we can set up a separate WebEx to co-create this piece of work. Now, I want to hand over to Susan, who's going to talk us through her session. And I'll just give you the presentation ball. Oh, you've got it, brilliant. To take us through your slides.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Dom. And I'm really delighted to be here today, and thanks very much to Dominic for inviting me, and my colleague here from Health Education is also here, Richard Price. Do you want to say hello? Well, we'll let Richard say hello at some stage, but so I'm Susan Kennedy, working at Health Education England on the Technology Enhanced Learning Programme. And the project that I lead on is our digital literacy project. It's a project that sits actually between two programs, and another that you may have heard of is one called the Building a Digital Ready Workforce Programme. That comes directly from the National Information Board, which is charged with this massive nationwide personalised health and care 2020. So a huge number of work streams under that, delivering all sorts in terms of IT and digital across health and care. But the Building a Digital Ready Workforce Programme is exactly as it says, and aligns, as I say, with the work that we do in the Technology Enhanced Learning Programme. Namely, how do we skill up nearly 3 million people who work in our health and care sector across the country? And this has been identified as a really important need, that if we're truly to transform in terms of digital, if we're truly to deliver the best care that we possibly can give to people, then we really need to maximise on the technology that is currently available, but obviously the technologies that are becoming available more and more. And so we know that the skills that people have, the capabilities that people have, generically and sort of across the patch, fall short of what we need at this moment, let alone what we need for the future. And of course, you know, we're all aware that things are changing at such a rapid pace that we can't simply wait for new generations to arrive into the workforce. And of course, that's been demonstrated to not only be not swift enough, but also to be falsely premised as well, because we know that young people, supposedly digital natives, may well be in some ways, it's not uniform, and they lack some of the specific digital capabilities that are required anyway. So just this quickly looking at this slide, this is kind of our best case scenario currently, and happens in some parts of our country, an integrated health and care system that is really using digital to its advantage. And you can see in this diagram, you know, we're foregrounding care homes, people's individual homes, the community, with the hospital retreating into the background. This is the kind of the care landscape, health and care landscape, that is envisaged and that is slowly being transformed. And you can see just from the illustration there different ways in which we hope that digital will connect people. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that people are properly skilled. And Health Education England, we have talked about the definition that we want used across health and care, digital literacy being plural, of course, and we talk about capabilities rather than competencies, because we think capabilities is much more about what people are potentially able to do, and it's also about attitudes and behaviours as much as it is about knowledge and skills. So key for us here is the fact it's about living, learning and working, but it's about inclusion, it's about participation, and it's about thriving. How do people maintain their own well-being as health and caregivers in a digital landscape, as much as they're caring for the people who are their patients or service users, etc. And so we devised a digital capabilities framework that speaks to that definition. And we have 6 domains that we think help categorize the digital capabilities that we need that workforce really to take on board and to continue to develop. And so what we do know is that for a lot of people, whether they're working in a hospital, in a care home, whatever services they're working in, they can see digital or IT as something that geeks do in a cupboard, that it's all about technical proficiency. And we're really working hard at trying to communicate that a lot of what people do already in their work is already digital to some extent, but that it's the ordinary things that they would be doing as part of their role that are increasingly digital and need to be so. So this is our framework. Now, in terms of how we get people to, first of all, identify which of the capabilities they already have and which they might want to develop, what we're doing is looking at now how we can get people to self-assess their own levels of digital literacy. And once we get to that place, then what we want to do is to make sure that people can receive signposting or targeted resources that will be motivating to them because it's directly tailored to areas for development that we've been able to help them identify. So this self-assessment process is really important to us because what we do know is that people's ideas about their own level of digital literacy is very subjective. So lots and lots of workshops that we've done, and we've developed this framework with stakeholders, with employees throughout health and care. What we know is that if you say something like, you know, if you're able to send and receive emails, does that make you a digital novice, maybe perhaps at an intermediate level, or a digital expert? People will place being able to send emails in each of those categories. So somebody who's perhaps unfamiliar with a lot of the digital world will consider themselves to be quite expert if they can send an email or if they can take part in a WebEx. It's very, very subjective. And we don't have good data at the moment in Health Education England or anywhere in the NHS on what specific levels of digital literacy people have. Not gathering that data. And as I say, it's about trying to ensure that people will receive really targeted, focused learning resources that will help them. So, thinking about this, and again, part of the role of Health Education England is really looking at what's out there. We have a whole project on horizon scanning, and to look at what tools there are currently available or potentially will be coming on stream that can help with remit of Health Education England, which is about the education and training of the whole workforce. So we decided to partner with Global Filtered, and I'm delighted that Chris Littlewood and Catherine Barnett and Victor Babu from Global Filtered are able to join us here today because they had a product that we felt could help us investigate the things that I've been outlining. Self-assessment for people aligned to our digital capabilities framework, and then the targeting to people of resources that may help them in the development in the areas where they're found to be most in need of that development. So we have engaged in this pilot with them, and I will describe it in very basic, simple terms, but I'm sure they will be able to give a lot more detail here. But essentially what we want is for people to go to the site and be curious about their own digital literacy, to engage with a chatbot, which will ask a series of questions, and there are different levels of questioning. Obviously, the more questions someone answers, then the more able we are to build a picture about their level of digital literacy. And on the basis of that questioning, then to identify for them against our framework the areas where they have strengths, the areas where they may need most development, and then to start scraping resources that can be targeted at them. And of course, the thing about personalised learning, what do we actually want to achieve? We want learning that matches the pace of the learner. We want learning that is available to them when they want it, and where the format of the learning that they're presented with suits their needs. So whether it be a 10-minute video, a 6-week course, whether it be a PDF, whatever. And we're using this as well with data that we have recently been able to get through working with an organisation called Towards Maturity. I don't know whether any of you were at the Learning Technologies Conference last week, but a big presentation and launch from Towards Maturity there, who gathered data about learning across different sectors. And so they undertook a big chunk of work for us, which has told us a great deal. But what we do know is that time is precious to anybody working in health and care. And of course, we would all like to wave that magic wand and make sure that everybody had as much time built into their working day as could be possible for education and training. That's not necessarily going to happen anytime soon, but what we do know is people are using their own devices and using their own time, whether it be lunch breaks, travelling to work, at home, the weekends, to undertake learning, particularly if they're motivated. So we have that data to say that people are willing to do this, wanting to do this. At that point, I'm going to hand over to Chris Littlewood from Global Filtered. But before I do that, if anyone has any questions about the work that we're undertaking at Health Education England and how we're trying to skill people up, as I say, as per our digital capabilities framework, please do ask now.
Brilliant, Suzanne. What a really good roundup on the work that you're doing. Thank you for making it so succinct. I really like the fact that we're trying to get to a point where it's, precision learning that matches the pace of the learner and the format that's going to suit their needs. I really like that. There's a question here. I don't know whether it's something you can answer now. I know you're still doing some outreach work on this particular framework about your connecting to people outside of the current NHS system.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We're very aware that this. We want this to be a framework that can be used by anyone and everyone. So we had lots of stakeholder workshops. Again, I was in a care home myself, a residential care home, just after the new year, and interviewing care workers throughout that residential home. So we've done a fair bit of kind of ethnographic research. We've done focus groups, workshops. This document, any document, I would argue, that deals with digital literacy or digital capabilities cannot be a static set of competencies. It has to be dynamic. We're living in a world that is incredibly fast-paced, and that the minute we pin something down, it's potentially, if not outdated, things have moved on. What might pin you as expert in a certain sense today may just become absolutely mainstream and something that be expected to have in 5 years' time. But certainly we are wanting to consult with people as widely as possible and make this an iterative document. So Skills for Care, we're obviously been talking to Mark Nicholson, who's responsible for the care sector at NHS Digital, and as I say, kind of field work outside the NHS as well.
Brilliant.
And Lynn is saying there that AEFS has done a lot of work on digital literacy education and training as well. There's so much out there, and we are more than happy to touch base with anyone. Put us in touch with anyone that you think is doing good work, and we will definitely be wanting to speak to them.
Absolutely, in the spirit of collaboration. Thanks very much, Susan. I'm going to hand over now to the guys over at Filter, who's going to share some of the work around the use of algorithms and personalized learning. So let me just get this passed across to Chris and colleagues over there. Let me know if you've got this, guys, and I'll now hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Dom. Can everyone see the AI and learning slide on our screen now? Is that clear? Grand. So what I wanted to talk about was the particular strengths of artificial intelligence and how those can be applied to this question of how can you personalise learning for individuals and give them the stuff that they need. As Susan said, the stuff that matches the pace that they're working at, their current level of proficiency, the point of need that they're at and what their particular requirements are, and the sort of longer-term requirements of their role. Just to introduce ourselves a little bit before that, I'm Chris Littlewood, and I work here at Filtered on algorithm development. I lead the team, we call it the science team, that does algorithm development and design. And I'll let Catherine introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine and I am project manager at Filtered. So I oversee the implementation of all our global filter instances, and particularly this project that we're working on with Health Education England.
And somewhere in cyberspace we've got Victor, who he's our lead developer in the algorithm development team.
Hello.
So, like I said, first of all, I wanted to talk about the strengths of artificial intelligence. Let me just advance a slide. So if you follow AI generally, you might well be familiar with the example that I'm going to talk about for a little bit. But there's a particular thing that I want to draw out from it, which is applicable to trying to solve this problem of personalising learning. So this is an example based on the board game Go. In the news over the last couple of years, there's been an attempt by a company called DeepMind to write an algorithm that can play Go extremely well. In fact, their ambition was to beat the world champion player at Go, human world champion of this game. The reason that they picked on Go as an exercise was because they're interested in developing capability in artificial intelligence generally. And this is a particularly difficult artificial intelligence problem. Wasn't expected to be solved for many years in the AI community because Go isn't very amenable to computation. So compared to even, for example, a game like chess, the number of possibilities for players at each point in the game of Go and the number of possible games that can eventuate is massive, astronomically greater than chess even. So computers can't solve the problem in a crunching way. They can't just grind through calculating what the consequences of any particular move are and cascade that down through the successive competencies to see which moves are going to result in a strong position and weak position, or a win or a loss. They have to play the game in what I think of as a more human way. They have to spot patterns, they have to understand which sorts of moves have led to strong positions and which have led to weak positions, and what a strong and a weak position look like. DeepMind engaged in this project. He played actually a couple of world champions at Go, Lee Sedol and KG, and beat them both in successive years. The way that they went about it is the reason I wanted to talk about this example in particular. Advance the slide. So the way that they trained this artificial intelligence to play Go was by emulation. What they did was they accumulated a database of lots of games of Go between strong amateur players of the game and trained the algorithm to emulate that play. So in the first iteration, they aren't training the algorithm to play like a world champion. It plays like a strong player of the game. It would lose to a world champion, but it would probably beat a decent club player. And the reason this is possible is the way that these the way that these algorithms can be trained through through emulation. You have a deep neural network. You train it so that it emulates the performance in a training set, so it copies the moves in that training set of data, the training set of games. Then when you show it a new game, it plays in a similar way. And that's the real takeaway that I want to emphasize in this example, that it's possible to train these flexible artificial intelligence algorithms to emulate human decision-making. So this is an example, obviously, in gameplay. But in lots of fields, these algorithms can be trained not by having to write complicated rules or design how they need to function in many different scenarios. You can just show them examples of the sorts of decision-making you want them to copy, and then they can employ that decision-making and massively scale up the capability of that decision-making beyond the individual humans undertaking it in the first place. So what AlphaGo actually then went on to do, what DeepMind did with the algorithm to get it to be world champion, was to play it against itself over and over again. And then again, it could learn which of the moves that it made resulted in successful positions and wins, and which led to weak positions and losses. And so it could iterate its performance to the point where it could eventually beat a world champion. It's interesting too, but not the main thing I wanted to not the main point I wanted to make, which was that there's this emulation of humans which is possible. How can we? How is that relevant to personalization? So, if we think about personalization in L&D, this is the sort of problem. The idea of connecting a learner with the right piece of learning at a given time is the sort of problem that's been solved in quite a lot of other sectors. So if you think about Spotify in the music industry, then that's a business that's been built substantially off the back of trying to identify what the particular requirements from a music point of view are of an individual, what tunes they like to hear. Similarly in Airbnb, it's about trying to identify the accommodation requirements of an individual and give them recommendations, make recommendations for places they might want to stay on holiday. And as you can see from the slide, there's a host of examples of businesses doing more or less, in that sense, the same thing. Understanding a learner's requirements, a user's requirements, a customer's requirements in these cases, understanding the potential content or solutions or products that they might be recommended, and then using an algorithm, often an algorithm based on artificial intelligence these days, to make the connection between the two. And so I guess when we're thinking about this problem in learning, we're following on in the path of these other sectors where the problem's been solved. Particularly in learning, though, there's the objective of skills gap. So when we start to think through how might we do this in learning, this idea of connecting a learner with the pieces of training content that are going to be most valuable to them, then what comes to the surface quickly is that there's the primary purpose of learning, which is to build skills or capability, knowledge, whatever terminology you want to use more precisely. And this is the way we think about this problem. We think about breaking down the idea of connecting a learner with training into a few steps. So there's connecting a learner with the skills that they particularly require, and that's about understanding what the requirements of their role are, what the requirements of the particular projects or tasks that they're engaged in at a particular time, and of course understanding what their current levels of capability are and where there are gaps there. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is about understanding the training itself. So what actually, for a given piece of training, what skills is it likely to build, and how will it fill those skills gaps? And then finally, the bottom of the triangle, that job of connecting the learner to the training, and that is, of course, a lot of that is about the skills that the training brings, but it's also, as Susan said, about the format and the preference of the learner. So if we think about a human trying to do this, if we think about us as L&D professionals trying to do this, connect a learner to training or make a recommendation to someone, then if we know that the job of doing that in a human perspective can be broken down similarly. It's about understanding the learner, knowing them well, knowing what's demanded of their role, knowing what is demanded of them and their current capabilities, how they can meet them, how those two things meet. It's also about understanding what the potential learning solutions are, what pieces of training might fit those requirements. So you can see that there is sort of human tasks here which are of the form that can be used to train an artificial intelligence. So to take a concrete example, imagine we have a library of content. we want it to be described in a framework that is relevant to our organisation. So we have a library of content. It might be a mix of stuff that's available in the cloud. It might be libraries that we've bought in but are categorised in a different way from our organisational priorities. Or it might be internally produced content, might be news articles, anything. How can we categorise that in a way that makes most sense to the audience of it? We want to apply classification to that in order to apply the framework that we're interested in, the competency framework that's most relevant to the organisation. And the way we can use AI there is to do that for a sample of that pool of training and then scale that up using the AI. So we can take that sample, train a deep neural network to do the same job, and then point that AI at a bigger body of training or a stream of potential articles and classify them into the system in a way that would be uneconomic or at least very costly to do manually. So where we want to end up with this sort of approach is to make recommendations. So this is just a screenshot of the sort of thing that we're trying to do. So prioritised set of recommendations. Each of these rectangles is a piece of training, an article, a video, something that we think is relevant for this individual, and those are structured according to skills that might be relevant for them. So this is the sort of end point. This is where we're trying to get to with that algorithmic work, to be able to prioritise a library of content using algorithms and AI so that it matches the particular requirements of that individual learner. And just to finish, I just wanted to sort of list out some of the sorts of human tasks that we do in L&D that is amenable to this sort of training approach. And so some of these are very hard things to write rules for. So if we think about selecting potential pieces of training or articles for organisational fit, that can be a really hard thing to codify, really hard to define what the specific criteria are to select stuff that is appropriate or relevant or supportive of organisational priorities. But it's the sort of thing that actually humans are good at. Humans can internalise the requirements of their organisation. They can understand them, even though it's hard to express exactly what those requirements are in a set of rules. But the advantage of this sort of AI approach is you don't need to express it as a set of rules. All you need to do is do it on a sample of assets, of pieces of training, and then the AI can take over and copy that decision making. That was everything I wanted to say. I'll hand back to Dominic.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. This is really exciting, and it's great to see Health Education England take this forward. John, do you have any questions you want to come in on that? I know this is a space that you're quite interested in as well. Before we hand over to Eleanor over at Reform about some of her work for the last 20 minutes.
Yes, so thank you very much, guys. I wonder if you could speak to the licensing of the algorithm. I've just jotted down 2 questions in the group chat. One question is around the algorithm and whether or not people sort of from other sectors, parts of the National Health Service might be able to use that algorithm and what licensing conditions might be for Global Filter. And then another question, I guess directed a bit more at Susan, wondering about the availability of training materials and data about training that Health Education England has access to. Yeah, so I guess algorithms and available data, if there's any further information you could provide, I'd be very interested to hear.
Sure. So on the algorithm, so I guess first of all, when we implement an instance of the recommendation engine, our focus is usually on a particular competency framework, skills framework. So we'll work with the client to define the skills that they're particularly interested in and train the instance to work with that set of skills. So it will suit a particular audience driven by the skills and also the profile of that audience, so the way that the audience would describe themselves, the roles in that cohort. But that aside, then it's very scalable. So sort of access to the product can scale straightforwardly. So if the question's about can you separate the algorithm from the recommendation engine, then components of it can run separately. So for example, the tagging algorithms we can run offline, and we're working on, or at least it's on our roadmap to enable the algorithms to work as an API, so they can be called from another platform. But that's not a capability that we have currently.
And presumably, then it's not really an open source algorithm or permissive licensing around it. So any other parts of the system that would want to use the algorithm would have to sort of go through your company rather than work in sort of parallel or supporting it.
That's right. Currently, at the moment, then none of it is open source.
Okay.
John.
Yes, Susan.
John, I'll jump in on your second question. I think there's probably two parts to that. As part of the work that we've been doing, we've already spent some time identifying existing training materials that are out there, and the easiest way for anybody to access those is to go to the Health Education England website. I'll put a link in the chat box, and we had some research commissioned that has an appendix with existing materials that were located, and we're going to be working with Global Filtered to utilise those existing identified training materials. In terms of the data about people in health and care, as I say, we did this work with Towards Maturity, and we're just putting that data together in as accessible form as we can. And again, we'll make that available because that provides some really useful evidence about how people learn, what motivates them, what the barriers and the enablers are, and how to target learning most suited to people's needs. And that will be shortly available.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Just so if it's okay to ask an extension to that question, around just the scale, it's very difficult to sort of get a sense of the order of magnitude in relation to the amount of training materials that might be available that could be sort of processed. It might not be an easy question to answer now, but if you did have any sense of the sort of scale of the rich media data that is used in training that is available to you at Health Education England, that would be great.
So we found, well over 1,000 individual assets, but I have to stress that obviously this is not and cannot be absolutely comprehensive, simply because it's a very fluid landscape out there, and undoubtedly there will be things coming on board all the time. What we were trying to do was see what there was and map that to the framework, so that we could identify where the gaps were. Because one of the things that we're doing as part of the Digital Literacy Project is obviously looking at what resources may need commissioning or developing, and we cannot justify creating things if they already exist, especially if they already exist and they're freely available to staff. And so we really do need to get a sense of what's actually needed, and we're tackling that in lots of ways, and lots of work going on in both the Technology Enhanced Learning Programme and the Building a Digital Ready Workforce Programme. But I won't rattle on.
No, well, yes. Thank you very much.
There's a lot existing, but it doesn't cover everything in terms of all the digital capabilities that we've identified.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I do have another question, but I think that probably it's, Dom, can I take it on your advice, whether or not there is time to ask?
Let's come back to that, because I think we need
Sure.
Al to come on as well. We want to be respectful of time. So
Great.
I'm sure we can have this conversation in the chat box as well, because we've got Eleanor Horwick from Reform, independent think tank, who's going to talk about some of the work that they've been doing. They've released a paper called Thinking on Its Own, AI and the NHS. And if you haven't read it, it's highly worth the read. And then the last 5 minutes, I'm going to hand over to Tina about some of the work that we're trying to do about collecting some information. So, Eleanor, I'm just going to hand you the presenter rights, and you should, fingers crossed, be able to connect and speak. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, completely.
Brilliant.
Okay, I think this is definitely, to sort of Susan's point, is going to be a test to my digital literacy, because I'm not 100% sure of how I'm supposed to change the slides.
So on the top.
Oh, on the top. Okay, got it.
Top, you got this is 0, 1.
Fantastic. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for sort of having me today. I thought that what I would do is sort of present a sort of selective overview of the paper. Selective in the sense that I don't think I can sort of cover full ground, but I will try and do as much as possible. So I thought I would give you a bit of context about the project itself, and maybe actually would start off by saying a few words about Reform. So Reform is a Westminster-based think tank, non-partisan, that looks at different ways of delivering value for money within the public sector. It does that across different policy areas such as healthcare, education, criminal justice, and welfare and pensions. We sometimes do also sort of cross-cutting projects such as looking at commissioning within the public sector. And so sort of more about the project itself, I thought that I would sort of start off by presenting myself and my co-author, Kate Laycock. So Kate is a doctor, and was interested in policy and doing some policy work and sort of understanding or having, or at least gaining some sort of a different understanding of healthcare. And so she decided to work for Reform for about a year. And she used to lead Reform's work in health. And a bit about myself. So my background is in economics for public policy evaluation. But I always, I would sort of best describe it as had a sort of little inner nerd that was sort of fascinated by science and tech more generally. And about a sort of year and a half ago, I sort of did an introductory course in sort of neural nets, and it was one of those moments where I felt that my face looked like, you know, that sort of little emoji that has the sort of hearts instead of the eyes, and sort of that changed things for me a bit in the sense that I just thought, okay, how can I sort of combine these two interests that I have, and sort of started looking at the applications of machine learning within the public sector at large. And so the way that this project happened, which is the second point on the slide, was a bit more by accident, more than design, in the sense that it wasn't sort of part of the work that Reform had planned for the year. It was just a case of Kate having a bit of extra capacity. I had a bit of extra capacity. Our deputy director at the time said, "You have never worked together. Why don't you do something in AI and healthcare?" And it sort of started off like that. And it was a very sort of interesting 8 to 9 month long process. We did approximately 35 interviews. I'm saying approximately because some people we've sort of interviewed several times. And so we didn't keep like perfect count, but we kept count of the number of interviewees that we had. We also devised an advisory board for the paper, who were absolutely incredible in sort of supporting us through the work and really sort of, I guess, having that almost PhD tutor-like role of sort of carrying the paper to shreds and asking for restructure and so on. We also had a network of external reviewers, which, you know, sort of gave incredible amounts of feedback, which was really great. And one of the things that I think is sort of important to mention is I think when we sort of got into the area, potentially because the project happened by accident and not by design, the goal of the paper sort of changed as we were doing more and more research. It was meant to be sort of quite a short piece, very forward-looking policy paper, and then it just became something else along the way when we sort of were looking at addressing different types of questions. So one of the things that we ended up looking at within the paper was the potential for AI in the NHS. And I think one of the things that we had sort of very clearly in mind from the start was the idea that it shouldn't be about technology first, and it should really be about, you know, what are the goals, aims, outcomes that the NHS is sort of trying to achieve, and how can technology be an enabler, which is why we based the sort of goals and aims in the 5-year forward view and tried to look at how AI could potentially help address the gaps identified in the 5-year forward view. So looking at the health and well-being gap, we looked at how AI could help with health promotion. So, you know, it's all about, for example, like using apps for personalized diet plans or fitness plans, and I guess sort of the whole idea would be to help people stay healthy. And I guess sort of most importantly in the sort of health and well-being gap is the potential for AI to sort of help the system shift from one that potentially focuses a bit more on acute care, and how AI can help the system shift to one that focuses a bit more on prevention. That can be done through sort of different techniques. We mentioned a couple of examples on the paper. One of them off the top of my head is, you know, the use of sort of clustering techniques to sort of have a better understanding of population health and new patterns of comorbidity that, you know, wouldn't have been able to sort of emerge had these type of approaches not been used. Then looking at the care and quality gap. So the sort of 3 things that we looked at here. One is how AI can help augment the cognitive capacities of healthcare staff. So one of the sort of examples that we use is, you know, sort of staying up to date and updating your knowledge, I'm going to find the right words. The medical knowledge of healthcare staff. So that sort of figure that is often mentioned is that there are 2.5 million articles published in the English language in sort of medical journals. So obviously staying up to date with information is, you know, virtually impossible if a human were to do it. So looking at how AI can help. Also, in that sort of narrowing of the care and quality gap, we looked at how diagnostics can be improved. So here, I think there's huge potential for improved diagnostics when there's when you use AI for image recognition problems. And sort of one of the examples that we mentioned in the paper is the clear benefit of using AI systems that are trained to recognize cancer cells in mammograms. And also, we sort of looked at the use of robots in surgery and how that can increase the sort of, quality of treatment. In terms of the efficiency funding gap, we mostly focused on the efficiency side of things. Basically looking at the potential for triaging systems to really get the sort of right intervention at the right time, and also huge potential in sort of the automation or partial automation of back office admin functions. So yes, I think that's it for this bit. And then the bit that took us a very, very long time was to look at the barriers to implementation. And some of these, I don't really like to call them barriers, because I just feel that some of them are sort of quite natural. So if I could say sort of barriers in sort of inverted commas. So one would be to look at the sort of buy-in of healthcare professionals and patients. So this is one where I feel that it's in a way sort of only natural that you might not immediately get buy-in in terms of the sort of trust that people have in these tools. I think it goes back as well to some of the points made by Susan earlier on around sort of people's digital literacy and training. I also think that there's a sort of question of timing, and an analogy that was used by an interviewee in the sort of research process of this paper I thought was quite interesting one, where he basically said that there's a sort of process of habituation to risk in a way. So he basically said, you know, imagine if Amazon had started selling washing machines immediately. It's obviously sort of very high risk. People would have not, you know, maybe trusted that, you know, spending £1,000 to buy a washing machine on the internet would have been the best thing at the time. And so you start with sort of small things, like buying a book, relatively low risk, and then you sort of build up trust that way. And I thought that analogy in terms of buy-in of patients and healthcare professionals is maybe an interesting one to take into account. And then another thing that we looked at is also, I guess, sort of the importance of user-centered design and the sort of user experience and user interfaces, in the sense that, you know, if Watson were, for example, IBM's Watson were 100% black box, and that you didn't have somewhat of an idea of the probabilities of why the tool eventually reached the decision that it would, then you would have, I guess, quite a lot of issues around healthcare professionals' buy-in into the sort of output of the algorithm. Whereas if you have somewhat of a degree of explainability of, given this input, this is why I'm giving you the recommendation, then it's a sort of completely different relationship between the sort of professional and the machine. Then we also looked a little bit at issues of sort of trustworthiness of data sharing systems. But I sort of won't say too much about that right now, but happy to answer questions around that. And we sort of then looked at two types of challenges. One that we termed sort of systems challenges, which I think most of you will be quite familiar with in terms of getting the data in the right format and data that is digitized and machine readable and good quality data. And that's one of the things that we felt was extremely important, because it sort of then feeds into some of the ethical issues that we looked at. Then there's also a challenge around accessing, linking data and finding out where the data is and if there are sort of potential legal barriers to accessing data. And finally, we sort of focused on the ethics of building AI in healthcare. As one of the sort of areas that we are going to actually do further research in is the sort of, I guess, ideas of fairness in public-private partnerships when there's sort of transfer of data between a part of the NHS, so be it a sort of, let's for the sake of it just say a hospital, to a private company, and then that the private company sort of builds a sort of image recognition algorithm. But that, I mean, basically what would be a fair reward? Is it okay if 10 years down the line they just turn around and say, well, we're going to charge you X amount, sort of extortionate fee for using this algorithm, when it would have never been able to be developed without the use of patient data? That's something that we mentioned in the paper, but we sort of didn't delve in that much. But we, Reform as an organization, is going to be looking at that and possibly sort of publishing a paper sort of later in the summer. So I'd be very happy if anyone has any sort of brilliant ideas around that to be put in touch. And very briefly, we looked at a sort of different elements that should enter into the certification procedures of AI algorithms, and the paper has quite a lot of recommendations. And I think I'll just leave it there, because if not, I will definitely go over time.
That was awesome. Thank you, Aaron. I recommend reading the paper, and the call to action there in terms of the second piece of research you're doing is really interesting. and ties into a lot of the separate conversations that people are having. You know, maybe bringing some of those conversations together and share some of the learnings that organizations are doing. And one of the pieces of work I identified at the start was kind of doing this mapping exercise of all those organizations that are looking at policy, looking at regulation, looking at ethics, and seeing if we can, you know, identify a way to bring them together or share some of the learnings and speed up the process. I know next session we've got Matt, who's going to be talking about ethics. But just in the last few minutes, I wanted to ask Tina to come on and talk about some of the mapping exercise that some of the academic health science networks are doing. Tina, can I unmute you? Is that something I can do? Let's just try that.
Can you hear me?
Aye, loud and clear. Brilliant.
Yeah, excellent. So hello, everybody. Yeah, so I'm helping Dom and Melissa at the Kent, Surrey and Sussex AHSN with some upcoming work, and it was really, really interesting to hear, Eleanor, your bit. I have read the report. I read it with great interest, and certainly I think all the recommendations that came out of the report were, you know, completely, you know, bang on, and certainly resonated a lot with some of the work that I'm doing and will be doing, obviously, with John and Melissa. I think just picking up on that, we're just about to embark on a project which is very much about understanding where AI is happening at the moment across the ecosystem, and we obviously see this group here as a great forum to share what's going on. We're starting to plan a work program around understanding that ecosystem, doing a mapping exercise of where AI is happening. We're focusing initially on the diagnostics. And right now we're actually forming a steering group and also a whole sort of tier of satellite members who could come in and out of the steering group, and we're hoping very much that members of this community can help us in the task of you know, intelligence gathering, part of, you know, helping us build up that map, also participating in helping us with the survey that will come after and in tandem with the mapping exercise. And we'll be publishing a report that will be launched at some point in July. We're sort of sorting out the date at the moment, but it's very much about understanding the barriers and enablers, which I know Eleanor was sort of talking about, and a couple of points resonated with me about, particularly around the ethics, so that would be really, really interesting with the next session. But ultimately, you know, we see this community as being very much part of sharing, learning, and finding out what's going on, and at the end of the day, sort of dealing with some of the points that Eleanor had mentioned in terms of, you know, how AI can really deliver that health and well-being piece, the, you know, efficiency, productivity, etc. So I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
No, that's
I'm looking forward to it.
That's the thing with these sessions. We think, you know, an hour is a long time, but it's not. It just goes so quickly once we get talking. So first of all, I want to thank Susan and the colleagues from Filtered who talked about AI and learning, and Eleanor and the work that the Reform team have been doing. And I think it's really important that in terms of next steps, it'd be really good to connect with those individuals who want to work on some of those active work streams in the system, so that we can work on something tangible together. I'm conscious that the time is now 2 o'clock, and people have other meetings. If not, they've been taking this session in their lunch break. The next session is on the 7th of March. We'll be with Matt Clinic, and we'll be talking about ethics. So there'll be another email invite out on that directly. If you are interested in talking or convening any of the conversations that you feel are relevant or have any programs of work you need support on, please, just so we can work together on these bits and pieces. And I'd like to thank all those who have joined us live in today's session. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please continue to get involved in the conversation. On that note, I'd like to end today's session and look forward to connecting with you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to everybody.
Thanks, guys. All the best.
Thanks, guys. I'll keep this open for a little minute if anybody wants to message anything.